Putin's nuclear threats have finally gone too far, and now even China is telling him to knock it off. On November 19th, Putin updated Russia's nuclear doctrine, declaring that any large attack, nuclear or conventional, could justify a Russian nuclear strike. He even warned that Russia could nuke Ukraine and its allies, like the US or UK, if they keep supporting Kyiv. It was meant to scare the West into backing down. But instead of intimidation, Putin got a slap on the wrist from China. Yes, China has had enough of Putin's reckless nuclear rhetoric and just issued its strongest warning yet. Stop threatening nukes, or there will be consequences. Coming from one of Russia's few remaining allies, this warning is a major blow to Putin's image and his already shaky relationship with Beijing. So why is China so fed up? And what does this mean for Russia's future? Let's get into it. We begin with the warning. On November 4th, Politico reported that Chinese President Xi Jinping had levied his most direct criticism of Putin's special military operation yet. This initial warning came just a couple of weeks before Russia made its new nuclear doctrine official, but it seems Xi may have had an inkling of what was coming. Xi told Putin that he shouldn't resort to using nuclear weapons to topple Ukraine. He even called on Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, to push for peace talks between Ukraine and Russia as soon as possible. In a statement published by Xinhua, which is China's state news agency, Xi said that the entire international community must jointly oppose the use of or the threats to use nuclear weapons. He added that the entire world should advocate that nuclear weapons cannot be used, a nuclear war cannot be waged, in order to prevent a nuclear crisis. On the surface, that seems like a fairly general call to all nuclear-capable nations to simmer down. However, Russia is the only nation capable of launching nuclear strikes that is making threats right now. So it's easy to see this as Xi indirectly sending a message to Putin that he needs to calm down on the rhetoric. Xi didn't go so far as to tell Putin that it was time to withdraw, but again, the indirect nature of the Chinese approach comes through. Xi's call for Scholz to oversee peace talks is another veiled message to Putin that it's about time he ended his special military operation. These veiled warnings showed that Beijing was becoming increasingly wary of Putin's apparent desire to rely on Russia's vast nuclear arsenal to get its way. But as we now know, Putin didn't listen. By November 19th, he had a new doctrine in place that served as a clear threat to the US, UK, and France, all nuclear-capable nations, that he would launch against them and Ukraine if he felt pushed to do so. President Xi wasn't happy. And that's what pushed Beijing to issue its final warning to Russia. On November 29th, 10 days after Putin made Russia's new doctrine official, the Chinese Foreign Ministry held a press conference through which spokesperson Mao Ning made China's nuclear position clear. China is paying close attention to the nuclear risks triggered by the Ukraine crisis and has reiterated time and again that nuclear weapons should not be used and nuclear war must not be fought, she said. Mao added that China is encouraging all parties to remain calm and exercise restraint amidst reports that the US is considering returning nuclear weapons to Ukraine as part of a deterrent measure against Russia. Joint efforts are needed to cool down the situation through dialogue and consultation to reduce strategic risks. Through these two warnings, we see China trying to maintain its supposedly neutral standpoint in relation to the war. Only that maintenance is tinged with a little fear. Perhaps Beijing believes that Putin is starting to teeter over the edge with this latest round of nuclear threats. And if that's the case, China doesn't want to even consider being on the side of the country that plunges the rest of the world into a nuclear war. Will the Kremlin listen to China's concerns? It may have to. After all, China is believed to have expressed its desire for Putin to rein in his nuclear rhetoric as far back as July 2023. That's the month that The Guardian reported that Xi had held a private conversation with Putin during a state visit to Moscow in which he urged Russia's leader against using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. At the time, the Kremlin was quick to dispel these rumors. "No, I can't confirm it," Putin mouthpiece Dmitry Peskov said, when reporters asked if Xi had delivered an anti-nuclear message during his trip to Moscow. But that denial doesn't mean much. Russia uses propaganda and subterfuge to try and subvert any news that it doesn't like entering the media. The odds are that Xi did deliver a warning back in July 2023 to Putin behind closed doors. Russia didn't listen. Now, China is going a lot more public with its warnings, meaning Russia can no longer claim not to have received or heard them. It's a very clever move by Beijing. Its warnings let Russia know exactly where it stands on the nuclear issue. They also allow China to loosely align itself with the Western powers being threatened by Russia's new doctrine in calling for Putin to de-escalate. China has gone public with its warnings to Putin. That leaves us with some questions. Why has it chosen now to deliver that final warning? And what does this mean for Russia and its relationship with China going forward? It's here where things get a little complicated. In the immediate sense, China issuing its anti-nuclear warnings to Russia suggests that there's at least a slim prospect that Putin will lose China's support if he continues down this nuclear warpath. That may seem like a strange claim to make, seeing as the two countries have previously proclaimed that they have a no-limits partnership. However, there were already signs that this partnership was struggling long before China delivered its final warning to Putin. For instance, a joint statement released by China and Russia in May 2024 conveniently omitted any mention of the supposed no-limits partnership between the pair. That was notable given that the statement commemorated the 75th anniversary of the two countries establishing diplomatic relations. Putin's visit to Beijing in May 2024 also offered hints that the relationship between the countries is starting to get frosty. Putin enthusiastically claimed that he and Xi were as close as brothers during the visit. Xi, on the other hand, called Putin a good friend and a good neighbor. A positive statement, of course, but it's telling that Xi doesn't consider Putin a brother, but rather a friend. It's a lot easier to break ties with friends than it is with family. All of these little signs of splits in the relationship are bad news for Russia. That's especially the case given that Russia has been relying on China as one of its major trade partners in the wake of the sanctions the West has placed against it since February 2022. Two-way trade between the countries was $240 billion in 2023. It seems like 2024 is going to have similar levels, with Reuters reporting that trade between the two amounted to $202.2 billion between January and October 2024. It's also worth noting that China had been providing Russia with dual-use components for most of Putin's special military operation. These are components that typically have commercial purposes, but can also be used militarily. Through this clever version of trading, China has managed to stop short of sending weapons to Russia while giving Putin what he needs to build his own equipment. All of this is trade that Russia desperately needs given its ailing economy and its flagging military. And it's trade that might disappear entirely if Putin follows through on his nuclear threats. After all, China being an established ally of a nuclear weapon-launching Russia would mean its trade with the West would take a massive hit. Xi's warnings to Putin thus carry a financial element. Stop with the nuclear rhetoric, or China may be forced to take the billions of dollars it's pumping into Russia's economy elsewhere. That's worrying enough for Putin. But as concerning is the fact that Russia's new nuclear doctrine is at complete odds with how China approaches its nuclear weapons. In Putin's perfect world, he'd be able to rely on China to bolster his nuclear threat against the West. Not that his threat needs much bolstering. As of July 2024, Russia maintains a nuclear arsenal of 5,580, according to the Arms Control Association. Around 1,500 of those nukes are strategically deployed, with 4,380 tactical nukes and 1,200 in the midst of being retired making up the numbers. Still, adding China's 500 nuclear weapons to that tally, along with the extra 1,000 it's anticipated to build between now and 2035, would add even more credence to Putin's nuclear threats. The problem is that China's nuclear philosophy doesn't match Russia's. China maintains a no first use policy, meaning it will absolutely refuse to use nuclear weapons unless another country attacks it with nukes first. It's had that policy since it became nuclear capable in 1964, and reaffirmed it as recently as July 2024. In fact, China is one of only 2 nuclear nations, along with India, to have this sort of policy in place. Think about what it means in the context of Russia's new nuclear doctrine. Putin now permits himself to use nukes in the case of large-scale conventional weapons strikes as well as nuclear attacks. He's willing to attack non-nuclear nations like Ukraine. His doctrine also says that Russia reserves the right to launch preemptive strikes if its systems pick up on even a hint of a nuclear missile being sent its way. These are all policies that China diametrically opposes, and Beijing wants no part of working with a nation that would launch nukes and ask questions later. There are clear philosophical differences about the nature of nuclear weapons and their usage between China and Russia. That casts an interesting light on China's final warning to Russia. It's telling Putin that it doesn't support his new doctrine, and that it may be willing to withdraw from their partnership if he follows through on his threats against Ukraine and the West. Xi will hope that this will be enough to convince Putin to back off from his nuclear threats. After all, it was only in January 2022 that China, Russia, the US, France, and Great Britain published a joint statement saying a nuclear war should be avoided. The Kremlin published that statement, according to Reuters. It saw all 5 say, "We affirm that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. As nuclear use would have far-reaching consequences, we also affirm that nuclear weapons, for as long as they continue to exist, should serve defensive purposes, deter aggression, and prevent war." A little over a month later, Putin launched his special military operation. And so much of what's come out of his mouth in the nearly 3 years that have followed runs counter to the spirit of this joint statement. China clearly wants Russia to stop making nuclear threats, and it's getting closer and closer to limiting its support of Russia to make Putin see the light. So we see philosophical differences and signs of splintering in China's relationship with Russia that were forebears to Beijing's final warning. China may be subtly indicating that it's going to end its relationship with Russia if Putin launches a nuke. But there's another side of this coin. China is concerned about Russia, of that there is no doubt, but it's also concerned for itself. After all, its closeness to Russia means that it will essentially be treated as an accomplice by the West if Putin uses nukes. That's something that Beijing simply can't afford. And again, there are signs that China is wary of how the West would respond if Russia launches a nuke. Take what's happening in the Indo-Pacific as an example. The second half of 2024 has seen the United States strengthen its extended deterrence policies with Japan and South Korea. The US met with both in September, with each meeting leading to a reaffirmation and expansion of the commitments that all three have made to create regional stability in the Indo-Pacific. That's worrying for China. These extended deterrence agreements place South Korea and Japan under the protection of America's nuclear umbrella, which minimizes China's ability to be the Indo-Pacific's big power player through its own nuclear arsenal. In short, Beijing is already worried about Washington's increasing presence in a region it hopes to control. With Putin making nuclear threats while still ostensibly allied to China, he's only giving the United States more reasons to strengthen its defensive commitments around the world, including in the Indo-Pacific. Basically, if Putin carries on the way he is, China will have to deal with an even larger American presence than it currently has in its region. Xi's warning to Putin gains another component. He's not just telling Russia to stop with its nuclear threats due to philosophical differences, he's also warning Putin that his nuclear threats are causing more problems for China. That's not good news for an already slowly fracturing relationship, with China being more likely to abandon Russia than it is to sit back and allow Putin's policies to affect its position in the Indo-Pacific. Other American policies will also concern China, especially when it comes to sanctions. The United States and its Western partners have used sanctions to great effect against Russia. Castellum says that the West placed 19,535 sanctions on Russia, in addition to 2,695 it had in place before the war, between February 2022 and August 2024. More have followed. The most recent batch of US sanctions affects Russian banks that deal with international transactions, including those the country relies upon to handle key oil and gas sales. That move has been devastating for Russia's economy, as highlighted by the ruble cratering to a new low of 114 against the US dollar on November 27th. Russia has relied on China to work around these sanctions for much of the war, but Beijing hasn't escaped unscathed from this decision. Back in May 2024, the United States imposed sanctions on over a dozen Chinese companies that it believed were supporting Putin's war in Ukraine. It also announced new export restrictions that will affect China's ability to create its own advanced semiconductors, providing more evidence of America's increasing interest in the Indo-Pacific region. China is also facing up to the prospect of dealing with extensive tariffs when President-elect Donald Trump takes office in January 2025. Of course, Beijing isn't happy with Washington over these sanctions and tariffs, but it also knows that it's being targeted in part because of China's relationship with Russia. Outgoing US Secretary of State Antony Blinken made that much clear during his April 2024 visit to Beijing when he accused China of helping to fuel the biggest threat to Europe's security since the days of the Cold War. That wasn't an idle claim. The US truly believes that China is causing more problems than it's solving by working so closely with Russia, and it's willing to use sanctions and tariffs to curtail that relationship. China will obviously take note of all this, and with Putin's nuclear doctrine changes, it'll also know that Europe's security situation is even more fragile than it was when Blinken made his April claim. A Russia that keeps moving closer to the nuclear button is one that puts China at risk of even worse sanctions and tariffs. That's simply something that China cannot afford. After all, America is an even bigger trading partner for China than Russia. In 2023, two-way trade between the US and China typically sat at around $45 billion per month, hitting a high of $57.62 billion in October. If we assume a conservative $45 billion per month figure, that means two-way trade exceeded $500 billion last year, around $260 billion more than two-way trade between Russia and China. Statista's figures for the first 9 months of 2024 suggest that the monthly average between the US and China will be even higher. The two countries cracked $51 billion 3 months in a row between July and September 2024, with the festive period likely to see those numbers rise even higher. Why does that matter? It shows us that the United States is a far more valuable trade partner to China than Russia has ever been. And it's not even close. Trade with the US is around double that with Russia for Beijing. If Putin's nuclear doctrine and his constant threats don't stop, China may be forced to face the prospect of the US cutting back on that trade. That already seems like the case with looming tariffs. But Xi will hope that this final warning to Putin will be enough to allow China to negotiate a better deal with Trump when the president-elect enters office. Simply put, Putin is screwing up China's most lucrative relationship. Xi can't have that, so he's warning Putin to stay away from the nukes. It's also why China has steered clear of the cooperative defense pact Russia has created with North Korea. That pact makes China uneasy, while Russia and North Korea deepen their ties, vowing to resist what they call the US-led West in the process. China is more worried about its influence. It sees Russia encroaching, undermining its own ability to coerce North Korea into actions it prefers. What's clear here is that Beijing is starting to see Russia as a threat. Putin's nuclear rhetoric and his new doctrine make Xi uneasy because both run counter to how China approaches nuclear weapons. China is also very wary of worsening its shaky relationship with the US over Russia's actions. Whether Xi would say it or not, China needs American trade so much that it can't afford to take Putin's side. That's why it's delivered its final warning, albeit one loaded with implications, to Russia. Stop the nuclear threats, or Beijing will have to pull away from Moscow. Still, there's one more possibility that we have to consider. All of this posturing from Beijing could merely be a smokescreen to distract from the fact that China actually does support Russia in its nuclear approach. That's the argument put forth by The Coming Collapse of China author Gordon G. Chang in an opinion piece published by The Hill. Chang says that China's support of Russia throughout Putin's special military operation is indicative of two nations that still have very strong ties. China's nuclear admonishments are merely surface level, Chang suggests, because Xi sees in Putin a man who's bold enough to do what he can't do himself, disrupt the Western-led international system. Chang says China and Russia see the world in the same way. They've also both identified the United States as their enemy, meaning there's a possibility that China would choose Russia over the US regardless of the trade implications. Chang also points to China making nuclear threats of its own in recent years. When Japan said that it would defend Taiwan against a Chinese invasion in July 2021, Xi broke out the nuclear rhetoric. He did the same when Australia joined AUKUS alongside the US and UK a month later. Make no mistake, China's president is not immune to throwing China's nuclear weight around when he feels it's necessary. The difference between Xi and Putin is that Xi seems to understand that he is merely postulating that his enemy's actions might lead to nuclear war. Putin is outright saying it while putting the mechanisms in place to allow him to launch nuclear warheads in non-nuclear circumstances. That's a massive concern to a Chinese president who has ambitions to influence global geopolitics in his own way. It's also the reason China delivered its final warning to Putin. But what do you think about the relationship between China and Russia right now? Has Putin's new nuclear doctrine driven a wedge between the two nations that can't be removed? Will we see President Xi do an about-face on his support for Putin if Russia's leader leans even more heavily into his nuclear posturing? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you, as always, for watching.